So Jonathan, you're not only at the Citadel, but you have a very distinguished career working at the Pentagon. You were the press secretary for the Pentagon. You worked closely with the civilian government, but also in the military. And you have a perspective on geopolitics that's certainly an understanding how supply chains are being impacted by geopolitics. That's really unmatched. So we talk a little bit about what is the big sort of thing that's happening around the world that gives you some pause?
Well, first off, thanks for having me here. It's always good to be in Atlanta. I think we've talked about this before. If you go around the globe and look at the hotspots, you've got basically everywhere. So it's Ukraine, you've the Middle East, you've got the South China Sea, you've got North Korea. So the big thing is that things are not getting calmer. And I think there was some expectation that post-President Trump, a lot of people expected with a Biden administration things to calm down around the world, and they seem to actually have been ratcheted up. And what we've seen is some of our adversaries kind of flex their muscles and try to elbow people out of space. Russia particularly has done that. China's done that. Some argument would be made that Hamas did that. They saw weakness in our responses. A lot of that is probably a result of, some would argue, a result of the Afghanistan pullout. The U.S. retreated on the world stage from Afghanistan in a way that created a vacuum there. And I think that the impression is that others have seen the U.S., particularly based on internal turmoil and political dissent and not being able to have a strong path forward. Others have started to step up and kind of see what space they can take and what they can maneuver into.
You know, it's interesting because I think about sort of the image and projection of Obama as a peace, a statesman, if you will. And yet we were constantly at war, I think, the entire presidency. Trump, as a very verbose, aggressive, unpredictable president, actually did not. Did we get into a single military other than what was already there? Did we actually have a single military?
There were engagements, but there was not the start of a new long-term engagement.
So, is it fair to say that the issues around Russia, China, the Houthi, regardless of who's president, would exist, or is your contention that if there was a different administration, that these conflicts would not be breaking around the world?
So I think there's a very good argument to be made that strength deters aggression. So showing that you're willing to use your own military, that you're willing to be aggressive in responding to attacks, that people will think twice. The example we've talked about before is the strike to kill Baghdadi. That was Trump showing very clearly, if you try to do attacks on U.S. personnel, because the Iranians have been behind attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq, we're going to take out your top-level people. Iran backed down for a while after that. So the strength people will back down from that. People will stand down. The question is, with China in particular, whether that's enough, because I think China, and you've had speakers at last conference, I know you had the one gentleman that talked about demographic changes. China's got a lot of things that are pushing it to be aggressive. So it wants to reunite with Taiwan. That's part of their political dogma and doctrine that they've had for 50 years, is to reunite with Taiwan. Demographically, they're aging out. Economically, they're not in as strong a position as they were, and so they've got a clock moving where they've got to do something. And so I think that's part of it. But I do think you could trace some of the aggression, particularly with Russia, to perception that the U.S. won't respond as strongly as it would have under different leadership.
But there's no good answers with China. And here's the reason I say that is, if China were to attack Taiwan, or even blockade it, U.S. policy is historically been sort of an unwritten policy that we would protect Taiwan, or at least that was sort of understood. Chinese understood that as well. It wasn't but they wouldn't say it. And then Biden sort of came out and said it. The problem is, I think Americans during, Afghanistan and Iraq especially, have become particularly this generation, has become very sort of adverse to getting American troops into conflicts that would repeat what we saw in Afghanistan and Vietnam. why would we want, other than the need to protect Taiwan, why would we want to put forces over there and get into a military conflict with China?
So tomorrow is the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And so you think about what that war involved, and particularly what that invasion on D-Day involved. So crossing the English Channel, the 20 miles or so, what that looked like. And then you look at what a conflict with Taiwan would be. So in World War II, we were reinforcing an invading army that had to go 20 miles. In Taiwan, we're going to have to reinforce our own military that's going to have to travel literally thousands of miles to get into the fight against a military that only has to travel 100 miles, 50 miles across the Taiwanese Strait. So it will be a magnitude more difficult than what we've done before, and that we'll have to do. I think you're right, Americans, and this is something that concerned me when I was at the Pentagon, was we had a commitment that we've made to Taiwan to defend Taiwan. The American people, I think, would be very surprised to wake up tomorrow morning and find out that we have American forces that are being deployed to Taiwan to fight China, when we won't even acknowledge that Taiwan is not part of China. You know, we have the two Chinas policy, so we won't even acknowledge that it's a separate nation, but we're going to go to war over it. So I think Americans would have a hard time getting with that. But the answer on how to deal with that, though, is going to be through alliances and through partnerships in the region. So just this past weekend was the Shangri-La Dialogue, which takes place in Singapore every year. And it is basically the high-level meeting of all the military generals and ministers of defense for the Asian countries. And others attend as well, the US, the UK. But the big participants are obviously China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Cambodia. All of these countries get together to talk about their issues. And the issue's the same. It's China. And they're all united in pushing back on China's efforts and expansion. So the hope would be that in that type of conflict, you would find other like-minded nations that would be willing to assist and push back.
But do you think, I mean, pushback is one thing. I mean, it's blockades, lots of ways to blockade trade.
Trade is probably going to be.
But the idea of putting U.S., like you said, I think Americans would be, I mean, we've seen the controversy around Ukraine,
Yep.
which, you know, Americans are very, and we've seen the polarization of Israel, which is a historic ally of the United States. We've seen what's happened there. I can't imagine a scenario where there is political upside for a politician that commits troops in Taiwan. Other than economic and blockades potentially, do you think there's a case to be made for U.S. troops?
I think people will make that case, and I think the number one reason you would make that argument is that if we do not physically assist an ally and a partner in defense of their homeland, others will see that as we will not back them. So one of the things you heard about during the Trump administration a lot was how Trump kept saying, our NATO allies need to spend more or else we need to get out, or Japan or Korea needs to spend more on their own defense before we get out. And people claim that he was abandoning NATO, he was abandoning our allies. If we abandon an ally that we have been supporting for 50 plus years, once China finally moves, that will be a signal to our other allies in the region, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Australia, and others, that we might not be as serious about protecting them and helping them, and they need to reevaluate their principal relationship in the region. So that would be the number one reason to do it. The other thing, is kind of a tangential issue on this. We talked a little bit about TikTok before we came out here, but one of the issues we have in this country is that a lot of the belief systems and what people are learning about international issues, particularly on the younger generations, is coming through social media and through medias in which our adversary controls. And so the perception of our values are being eroded by that. And without us taking steps to prevent that or to reverse that, you're going to have a populace, like we're seeing with the Hamas conflict, where we have people that have very strong beliefs that seem untethered to the historic U.S. relationship with a partner.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of data on TikTok and some of the sort of extreme levels of content. We saw Congress passed a law, but I guess the question is, does that get enforced? Do you think that the TikTok enforcement, the actual demanding that the PRC or a Chinese company, which is connected to the PRC, sells off its technology. Do you think that's inevitability?
I think so. I don't. I don't know any other country that would basically allow a foreign adversary to have a direct conduit into forming the intellectual, emotional, and policy views of the next generation. And that's basically what we have. We have a fire hose from China that's pumping propaganda into people on TikTok. And a lot of people don't want to accept that, and they don't believe it. But if you look at the data on what TikTok does here versus in other places, it's indisputable that they are promoting certain narratives and certain policy views that are, if not beneficial to China, are at least harmful to the United States and our allies.
It is amazing to me that people are the conversation with folks that are on TikTok is, they're like, well, Mark Zuckerberg controls Facebook and he's manipulating me, or Elon Musk controls Twitter and he's manipulating me, but they're okay with a foreign adversary who has a doctrine to actually go out and change the way that Americans think about interacting with China and the PRC, that we're okay with it.
Yeah. And look, none of the social medias are perfect. None of the platforms. They're obviously developed to get you to either be angry or be jealous or whatever, to get you engaged more. Probably not a really helpful medium in terms of that. But the data I've seen, the studies I've seen, a lot of those, they may be pushing you things that you want to see that might not be helpful, but there's not as much evidence that they're pushing things that are eminently harmful to U.S. national policy as other ones. The big one that they all have in common, though, is, and this is kind of gets back to the Hamas October 7th response in the U.S., is a lot of social media, particularly TikTok, helps this subversive of trying to get Americans to be angry at each other. And it's interesting because you kind of politics, a lot of people think politics is a line. It's more of a circle. So the far left and the far right start to believe the same things. And so you see that with Hamas, where you have people on the far right who are anti-Israel and anti-war, and then you have people on the far left who are, I don't want to say pro-Hamas, I don't think that may be unfair, but are anti-Israel as well, and for different reasons. And so you see that happen, and you see a fracturing of what used to be a relative consensus about some of our policy views.
Yeah, and you put those people in a room, and you would say these people don't belong together, but their views are highly synergistic. Yep. One of the other things that's been talked a lot, I mean, immigration has been a pretty hot issue in recent years. There's been a lot of discussion on Twitter, and I take things with a grain of salt. I'm an active Twitter user. But I always sort of look at some of the stuff because some of it feels a little like, conspiratorial. But this idea that China is sending over nationalists to enter our country, and I almost wonder, is that xenophobia in terms of, hey, these people don't actually belong here, and we want to keep them out, they're evil, they're going to destroy our country? Or is there actual evidence from a national security standpoint that potentially these are actually government?
You got to be careful. You don't want to breed into what may be, anti-immigrant phobias about people because they're from a different culture. But in the last 3 years, we've seen over 100,000 people detained at our border who come from special interest countries. They're called special interest aliens. So they're from, North Korea, Iran, countries that might have issues with.
If I were in North Korea, I'd leave there too.
But we don't know exactly why you're leaving. You may leave there because you want to get out of North Korea. You may leave because someone has told you to leave North Korea. And so that becomes part of it because we can't vet people like that. So part of it with the legal immigration process, you have an opportunity to see and talk to people and figure out why they're coming. China, I think the question about whether there is a track record of potential people with malintent coming here from China, it's very clear. I mean, we've had espionage cases. We've had, there was a case recently of a professor who was basically working at one of our top universities and was funneling all of his top secret research back to China. And so there's definitely a track record. And to be said, I think we'd be naive to think we're not attempting to, on our side, gain intelligence on our adversaries as well. It would probably be malpractice for them not to be attempting to infiltrate people into the country through what basically is an open border, that people have their operatives who can get here and move freely. It would be malpractice if we didn't believe that that was happening.
I mean, the British wrote the book on espionage, and Americans applied it in the CIA. So but I think ultimately, economic sabotage, China has a track record, I think it's very clear, of taking American technologies and has taken them. But I often wonder about that. You mentioned and you touched on the Houthi attacks, and it's been a pretty big issue in supply chains because it's obviously disrupted the Suez. A lot of those products that went through the Suez actually were bound for Europe, a portion of them are bound for the United States, but it just created a massive amount of container inflation. Ryan Peterson talked about it this morning. What do we do about that? I mean, you said it's really an administration lack of response, but really, what do we do about that?
Well, I'll give I'll give Biden administration credit for the building of a coalition, particularly in Ukraine, to counter Russia. So I don't want to be perceived as thinking they're not doing anything. I think Jake Sullivan and others are working hard there. There is a naval coalition that is attempting to secure the Red Sea. But the Houthi attacks, basically, it's in response to the Hamas-Israeli situation. It's really ramped up since October 7th. The Iranians are funding it, are supplying it, are pushing it in an effort to stabilize. So you have a couple of courses. You can go through the offensive way, which we had operations to attempt to seize weapons, missile parts, and air defense systems that were going into Yemen. And unfortunately, we lost a couple of Navy SEALs during an operation recently doing that. So you can do that. You can attempt to, we've been bombing sites in Yemen to push back, putting additional pressure on Iran to quit supplying and bad actors in the area. And then the additional one, I think you've worked with Joe Lonsdale and others, there's a tier of defense tech firms that are trying to come up with answers. And I've worked with one where an electromagnetic system that's able to defeat drones or missiles or other things that you could put on a non-military vessel. So trying to find other ways to do it where it's not a military solution, but finding a way that you could actually develop technology that can help protect those. And those aren't tools that are 5 or 10 years away. Those are tools that are a year or 2 years away.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because pirates have been attacking container vessels for years. We have not yet, up until the last couple of years, seen military-grade technology being used to actually execute those attacks. That is why this conversation in terms of the Suez has been such an important one, because it's an escalation of this issue. There's a lot of geopolitical issues around the world. In terms of priority as it relates to the United States, our economy, and supply chain specifically, what is the part of the region that gives you the most pause right now?
The region of the world?
That you are the most concerned about?
Yeah, that's tough because you kind of have three really difficult areas right now. So you have Russia with Ukraine. If Ukraine was to fall, there's a chance that Russia could continue to disrupt Europe. Obviously, Europe as a whole is the third largest economy in the world, and that could have a significant factor on a lot of our trade over there. Obviously, the Israel situation is destabilizing supply chains running through the Red Sea, and then China is able to upend trade through the South China Sea at any moment. I would probably argue China's the biggest just because of the volume that goes through there and our inability to unilaterally prevent some bad outcomes.
I mean, it strikes me that if China wants Taiwan, they're going to get Taiwan. Like, if they are willing to if they have a Russian orientation to their military, which is like, I'm going to throw as many bodies out as I can and as much money, and torpedoes literally be damned, I don't care, that they will get Taiwan. That strikes me as probably the biggest risk to
It would be incredibly costly to them in terms of economically, militarily.
Does she care?
It could, because remember, although China is a communist nation, there's somewhat of an element of, I don't want to say democracy that goes into it, but they are selected for higher office based on performance and lower office and support. So they do have a sense, and they're focused on, basically the deal is in China is if the Communist Party continues to increase the quality of life for Chinese, the Chinese people will continue to support the Communist Party. An invasion of Taiwan would almost certainly decrease the quality of life for Chinese. They would be economic pariahs. There would be basically their manufacturing and exports would be shut down. There would likely be significant kinetic damage to their coast near Taiwan in retaliatory strikes from Taiwan and from others. So there would be a cost to bear. But China, I think their view is they're not going to have to physically invade. I think their view is we're going to push and we're going to twist and we're going to do it until people capitulate and just accept it, like they've done with the atolls throughout the South China Sea, where we're just going to build a runway here just for research. We're just going to put a couple missile silos here just in case, and until people accept that that's their territory, even though under international law it's not. So they're boiling the frog, so to say, and we'll see if they end up having to do that. But the issue there compared to, say, in Europe is, in Europe we have NATO. So we have an alliance, a military alliance that is prepared to strike back if Russia gets more aggressive. In China, there's not that same alliance. We have a loose ASEAN as an economic relationship, and we have a loose partnership with the Philippines, Australia. Obviously, we have treaties with South Korea and Japan and Australia, but there's not a same mutual defense pact between a lot of those countries. If there was a mutual defense pact between Taiwan, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, the U.S., you might see a different response. That doesn't exist. And that's one of China's big worries. With the Shangri-La conference, that was one of the big things China does not want to see. They do not want to see a NATO-like entity throughout Southeast Asia.
Fascinating conversation. Jonathan, really appreciate your time today.
Sure.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Appreciate
Thanks for having me.